Today, we are going to be talking about how security teams can identify criminals talking about your business on the dark web. My name is Alex Blackman, Head of Product Marketing for Searchlight Cyber, and we are an award-winning provider of automated dark web monitoring and investigation tools. I'll be your moderator on today's call. I'm also excited to share that we're joined by experts from within Searchlight Cyber, but along with one of our valued partners as well. So let me introduce them first. So as you'll see on the videos, we have Andy Papastefano, founder and director of the managed security service provider, Talanos Cybersecurity. So in addition to leading his company, Andy is additionally a member of the Industry 100. That's an initiative by the National Cybersecurity Centre, or NCSC, which aims to reduce the impact of cybersecurity by bringing together the top minds from industry and government so that organizations can share intelligence. So we're very happy to have you with us today, Andy. And last but not least, Mr. Rob Fitzsimons, Senior Threat Intelligence Engineer, podcast and webinar regular, expert in all things adversarial intelligence and dark web. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you to our presenters for today, and I'm looking forward to what you have to share. As always, this session is being recorded. It'll be made available on our Bright Talk channel very soon after the session has ended today. You should get an email to that recording as soon as it's available. The session is also interactive. So on the right-hand bar of your screen, you should see you have the option to submit questions, download attachments. Please do share questions throughout the session. I'll be moderating those as we go. Finally, if you haven't already as well, look at the paperclip symbol. That's your attachment section. There you'll find links to some of the articles we're going to reference later, as well as a link to subscribe to our popular cybersecurity web newsletter, Beacon. Additionally, you can leave feedback for today's session. And for those of you collecting CPE credits, you should also be able to download a certificate of attendance from within your browser at the end of the session. So do check out the paperclip icon. Lots of great resources in there for you. So now that that's all covered, I'm going to dive into what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to kick off with an overview of how cyber criminals get access to companies and often quite brazenly trade that access on the dark web. From there, we're going to break down some real world examples, one of which has had an update, I think, in just the last week. So we managed to squeeze that into the notes as well, and look at how we go beyond that initial shock of discovering credentials have been leaked, which is often just phase one of a cyber attack, to uncover what criminals do next, what happens to those credentials, how those leave you exposed. Then finally, we'll explore some of the key activities that security teams should be monitoring for, including initial access brokers and phishing as a service. So as always, if there's questions, please send them my way. I'll be keeping an eye on those throughout the session. But otherwise, with that, Andy, it is over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you very much for having me Searchlight Cyber. I'm Andy Papastefano. I'm the founder of Talanos Cybersecurity. I'm based in Guildford, which is just south of London, and I run a managed security services provider. We're highly rated on Gartner Peer Insights, so do check us out. Our team of analysts and engineers help customers on a 24/7 basis across a number of key areas in cyber, from helping to manage digital identities to 24/7 managed detection and response. If you follow the latest standards and regulations and security frameworks like I do, things like DORA in the EU or the latest version of ISO 27001, you will have noticed that there is a growing emphasis on being threat-led and threat intelligence. And so what does that really mean? It means understanding the attackers relevant to your business, who those adversaries are, the types of tactics and techniques they're employing, and understanding then the specific threat to your business so you can model those risks and have a way of responding accordingly. So at Talanos, we've always understood that. And, in an attempt to really understand what those threats are outside of our customer space, we've partnered with Searchlight Cyber for a really powerful threat intelligence platform, which is both DarkIQ, and Cerberus. We're trying to understand the attack surface of our customers, who the adversaries are, what kind of data that they've got around our client base. We've been partnered with Searchlight Cyber for just over a year now, and we have a very good relationship, actually. They do an excellent job of managing the partnership. We meet on a regular basis. And actually, Rob, you'll remember it was in one of those meetings that the topic of today's webinar came up. And really what it was around was, I'm using the platform in a very specific way. I've got particular use cases that I'm running for customers, but I don't know if it's the only way to use the platform, if there's other use cases that I'm missing. So it was really about an education session, sharing, what it is that I do for my customers, and perhaps all the things that I'm currently not doing, how we could bring that in. And so, Rob, just perhaps starting with you, if you think about the dark web, most people think about the three sort of main use cases around dark web monitoring. And so to start there, perhaps you can take us through what those main use cases are and some emerging trends in that space.
Yeah, perfect. So we'll go on the slide, please, Alex. So some of the key things that we see, and I'm having conversations with you, Andy, I think you see similar when your customers come and talk to you. Generally, people are interested in the leak credentials side of things. I think people over time have started to hear more and more around leak credentials being utilized in compromising organizations. We see more information in the news in the last few years around data breaches and personal information being shared. And with that, we see more conversations around that data being shared in places like the dark web. So I think there has been a general growth of that external interest as to where are these leak credentials, how are they being distributed, what can we do with them. But as we were looking into information and stats around for this webinar, one of the things that surprised me, I didn't realize quite how high this stat was, but a research by IBM Security X-Force indicated that over the last few years, there's been a 71% year-on-year increase in cyber attacks that use stolen or compromised credentials. And I find this particularly interesting. I think historically, we've always looked at or talked about organizations being exploited through unpatched vulnerabilities, but that requires technical knowledge and the technical capability to enable people to not only find where those vulnerabilities are, but also potentially develop exploits and understand how to exploit those vulnerabilities. That can become challenging. You need people, resource, and as I mentioned, technical ability. We've also talked about things like low-hanging fruit. Why would you target an organization that is particularly secure if you can rather target an organization that has their front door open? And this is kind of where the leak credentials side comes into things. We're not talking necessarily about leak credentials or email addresses and password combinations from several years ago. We're starting to identify information such as email address and password compromises from things like information stealers within recent days and weeks that people aren't aware of being compromised. And it's that information that users can start purchasing and start leveraging to gain very easy access into a network. Once that initial access has been achieved, ultimately they can potentially exploit the network or potentially introduce things like backdoors, remote access, and then sell that access further to the likes of as initial access brokers. That ties into the initial access area, which again is a growing area that we've seen. We'll touch on this in a bit more detail later on as to what specifically they are. But essentially they're people who kind of got the keys to a house, they've got in, they don't really know what to steal or what they're looking for, not necessarily the technical ability to do anything. So they sell that access, they verified it, and they are an initial access broker. And they will generally start selling that information in dark web forums, Telegram channels to the highest bidder, essentially. You can start tracking these conversations to see what's being sold, how much it's selling for, and often you see engagement of potential buyers outbidding one another to get this access. And the stats that we have on the screen here gives an indication as to the amount of posts that we've been able to identify year on year since 2022 relating to quite generic terms regarding initial access posts. As you can see, there's been a pretty significant increase in this activity in the last few years. 22 and 23, understandably a full calendar year. 2024 stats from January 1st to last Friday, so 19th of November. So we've still got a month to go and we're seeing the highest figures so far. And then finally, that phishing element. Again, it's a growing area that people have an interest in. I think we still fall for things like phishing emails, but we're also seeing a rise in things like phishing sites. And we'll come on to phishing as a service shortly in the webinar. This stat here from Statista, again, I found quite interesting that in Q1 alone of 2024, there's been over 960,000 phishing sites that have been reported. So this is averaging almost 11,000 phishing sites being stood up a day. And this really goes to show how widespread this capability is and how important it is to have capabilities in place to be able to detect these sites at the earliest opportunity and put some sort of mitigation in place, warn your customers, warn your employees, and make sure people are aware that these threat activities are going on and that we're not necessarily falling for them. As we go through the rest of the webinar, we'll go through a couple of these examples in more detail and show you how we can start investigating that information in more detail with these use cases. And I think, Andy, you're going to kick off with this first use case.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Rob. Those are very powerful use cases, I think, and it's normally the departure point for most people when they're looking to purchase a dark web monitoring platform, or at least a managed service like one that we provide. But we go a little bit further in trying to find extra ways that we can demonstrate value to the customers of our service. And it's really about understanding all of the risks that could potentially lead up to that initial access broker or that leaked credential. So I've got a couple of stories here, some of the common use cases of things that we detect through that metadata that lives in the dark web. Some of them are quite obvious and some less so. The one that customers are asking us a lot about at the moment is, how do I better manage my supplier risk? Can I pay for a service that's going to monitor the leaked credentials and initial access brokers and phishing sites of my suppliers? Because if they have tight integrations with us, that's the perfect vector into our own organization. Perhaps they're a critical supplier, and if their services go down, again, thinking about DORA and the EU, understanding the resilience of your suppliers is essential to being able to understand your own resilience. So we're getting a lot of requests on monitoring third-party suppliers of our customers across those three main use cases that you spoke about, Rob. The others, probably less obvious, and I'm not sure if people knew that they could do this with the Searchlight platforms, was you can monitor sort of typo squatted domains, so fuzzied domains that are sort of adjacent to your primary domain. You can go and you can monitor these things. And, earlier on in this year, Searchlight flagged one up to us that was just domain parked. It hadn't been attached to a mail server. It wasn't on a website or a phishing website or a spoofed website. It was just parked. And sort of 8 months later, someone attached a mail server to that domain and quickly weaponized it. And almost overnight, we're sending emails from it. And there's very little you can do from a takedown perspective before that abuse has happened, unless, of course, they've infringed on a trademark. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the sort of phishing example that I give a bit later. But a really powerful use of the Searchlight platform to discover these newly weaponized domains. So even if you can't do anything about it, you can keep on top of them at all times. You've then got something, I call them elephant pods. You will have seen those memes of these beautiful right angle pathways in a park, and people have completely ignored that and just crossed across the grass, and they've worn through the grass to the dirt. You call those elephant pods. how do we discover these in the customer's IT estate? I mean, it's happening all the time. The end users hate security. It's just it's a faff. So anything that they can do to try and circumvent it, they will. They're quite clever in that way. And so how do we detect where these controls have failed? A particular example was using the Dark IQ ability to tell us about Tor traffic. So there was outbound Tor traffic, basically anonymized traffic that was going from within the customer's environment outbound. Now, this customer provides a public Wi-Fi service within their premises, and someone had connected to it and wanted to watch their Netflix. So to bypass the policies on the outbound firewall, they connected to a VPN, and that flagged up as Tor traffic. And we were able to close that down quite quickly. We wouldn't have been able to see that policy circumvention again without the metadata that lives in the Searchlight platform. We, of course, discover a whole lot of shadow IT. Again, users just trying to, get business done. And they often get it done faster than IT can do it for them. So they start up their own SaaS services. They subscribe to all sorts of things. The favorite one tends to be Miroboard, which is sort of a whiteboard that you can use through your browser. And what they do is they'll stand this up for a quick meeting, and they'll dump a whole lot of customer enterprise sensitive data into the platform and then kind of forget about it. IT doesn't know about it. They can't secure it. There's no MFA. So those leaked credentials, they're quite bad if they're enterprise credentials, but they're even worse if they're to shadow IT because you can go and grab all sorts of things from the Miroboard. We found passwords to systems, architecture diagrams, customer sort of personal sensitive information. So there's all sorts that you detect when you're looking at the metadata of those lost credentials. And then, of course, personal device risk, something that is quite a challenge, I think, for CISOs and IT managers. You want to let people use their own devices, but potentially they're not as secure as the ones that they're bringing into work or the ones that you've given them for work. They don't have EDR, so they will be contracting malware stealers. So if your policy has been not allowing them to log in to your IT systems from home, we can easily detect that because that comes through in the metadata. You're going to see host names, IP address locations, the version of Windows. If it's a Windows home version that comes through in the metadata of the stealer, you know that this guy is using it from home. And the other thing that we catch them doing quite often is sharing credentials. Another particular story I've got there was a pen testing organization that we were doing dark web monitoring for, and they shared their Shodan account credentials. And that pen tester subsequently left the organization, but was still continuing to use the Shodan login. So, pretty poor from a pen test organization. They should have known better, but, you would never have been able to detect that, again, without the wealth of data that sits inside the Dark IQ platform. I want to just talk a little bit about historical data. Alex, if you can take us to the next slide there, please. What we do for a lot of CISOs and IT managers is we really try and unpack the value of that historical data. Even if those leaked credentials are no longer valid, let's say, the user has subsequently reset their password, or you've subsequently rolled out MFA to everything, what can that historical data tell us? And really, there's something that's quite interesting that we've discovered in running this exercise for our customers, is that you can see in this graph, I've mapped all of the leaks to the dark web over the history of this particular organization. So from 2016 to 2024, this is just the volume of data leaks, and you can see they're quite substantial. But the graph moves up and it moves down, and we were really interested in what was affecting that data. And chatting with the CISO, they were very specific. It was a new CISO that had been installed at this organization. And talking with him, there were specific controls that he put in place over a period of time, and it took him a few years to roll them out. The biggest one was, you can see it there at point 1, they implemented an EDR solution which reduced their Stealer malware. Before, it was just a very basic antivirus that they had on there before. And that had a huge reduction in both the volume, but if you look at the quality of the data, in the impact of that data as well. So the sensitivity of that data, there were fewer leaked credentials, there were fewer customer records just by implementing that EDR. Further decreased again by implementing multi-factor authentication, which they had done with Duo initially, but then they rolled out a centralized SSO with MS Entra across the entire estate, which really reduced the number of records that they were losing on a massive way. And, you can see the trend line there, which is the red line throughout. If you want to look at the scorecard or the report of the CISO, this guy's doing a bloody good job. He's spending money in the right places, and it's quite tough actually to go back and say, the money we spent on specific security controls has had this impact. Well, we can start to measure the efficacy of those controls by looking at the historical data of the losses to the dark web.
Just like point out there, Andy, I know you showed me this the other week, and I still really like this graph. I think it's a really useful illustration to contextualize the impact that employing these capabilities do have. And we always say a couple of things in the industry: there's no silver bullet, and it's about defense in depth. You can't have a single platform to secure an organization. You need these multiple different capabilities to help continuously secure that organization. You can kind of see there, after MFA is implemented, there is a slight increase in attacks again in 2022, which for me goes to say that people are starting to understand how to potentially exploit MFA, and then you need something else to come in to enhance that security further as well. With this activity, I know it's something I see in DarkIQ, particularly for our clients, quite a lot. Do you see a lot of activity around like password reuse across things like the shadow IT?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Robin. What I'll do is I'll answer that question as I'm going through my next story. We're going to dig a little bit into phishing and phishing data and some of the things that have come out of some of our investigations there. I'll just make a note of that question.
Trying not to steal your sandwiches, obviously.
So this is a particular case. People will have heard about this. It's Onyx, recently in the news, but I'll take you through the story from the beginning. This is a phishing kit, or phishing as a service, an Egyptian national that put this together off of the old caffeine phishing kit, and it's sort of offered as a service, a paid service, quite an affordable paid service looking at the numbers, where threat actors basically can insert themselves between the end user who's logging into Microsoft 365 and Microsoft 365 themselves. It proxies the legitimate M365 login page and MFA request through to the end user. So apart from the URL, the rest of the process is indistinguishable. And really, I'll take you through some of the pictures on the next slides after I get through sort of the high-level story, just what that looks like. But essentially, the password gets logged because the attacker sits in the middle. There's sort of a proxy, as well as the token. So this isn't the replay token, very importantly, which would sort of give them persistent access. It is the normal access token, which gives them roughly 90 to 150 minutes of access in the environment. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and what you should do. So one of our financial services customers, they actually have the 24/7 SOC from us, which includes dark web monitoring and threat intelligence. We detected a phishing mail going through to one of their VIPs. SOC picked it up, redirected it, and we spent a bit of time playing with the phishing kit to try and understand how it works. We typed in a whole bunch of test data, and when we were kind of finished playing around with it, we raised the incident reports with Microsoft and some of the government entities as well, where we report threat intelligence. and that helped to take some of that attacker infrastructure down, the infrastructure that was attacking our customer specifically. And then in October, we kind of forgot about it. And in October, interestingly, a whole raft of Onyx log data made its way into the Searchlight platform. And that was super interesting to look through. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the insights that we got from getting that data through. And again, I thought that was the end of the story until a week ago. And I've just put the links. They're both in the side panel, in the attachments of this webinar, but also on screen there. A week ago, Microsoft put out that they've taken control over 240 of the Onyx domains as part of a massive campaign to bring the phishing kit down. And what really helped them, I was speaking about trademarks earlier, was the Linux Foundation owns the trademark of Onyx, both the logo and the word. And that was used as part of a way to bring down and take ownership of the 240 domains, which is super interesting. I mean, apart from abuse coming from an IP or a domain, which you can use to take down the domain, the only other sort of surefire way of bringing it down is through some kind of trademark infringement. The registrars and the email servers and the web providers are pretty good at bringing that down if you make a good case and you follow the process. It's something that we help a lot of our customers to do. So yeah, just interesting that it was a Linux trademark that helped to bring that phishing kit down. So well done to Microsoft and Linux Foundation there. Alex, if you can go to the next slide. What I'll do now is I'll kind of just show you how this attack played out for our customers specifically. It started off with an email that went to the VIP. It was made to look as though, one of these messages that automated Microsoft messages that you get in your mail when someone has left a message for you. They've called in, they've left a message. The attachment is actually an HTML file, which if you double click, it's got a really nice user interface. It says decoding document, please wait, a bit of JavaScript in there that after a few seconds, it fails and it takes you to authentication required. And then it actually redirects you to the online phishing kit, which was then something called office call message.online that had our customers' domain prepended. So they'd spin up one of these subdomains for each customer in the campaign. And what was really interesting about this, and you see it often now, but it was interesting to us at the time, that they protected themselves with Cloudflare infrastructure. So, are you a bot? Protecting, any sort of automated tools trying to get into that environment to play around with the phishing kit. You've got to get past the Cloudflare, am I a human bot? which is quite interesting. Once you click through that and you get through to the actual Microsoft 365 page. Now I've blurred out the customer's logo, but it is, for all intents and purposes, it is the customer's login page being proxied exactly as Microsoft would have presented it through to the end user. And the only real tell, as I mentioned, was the URL. So unless you're training your end users to look very closely at the URL and not just the logo and how the screen is branded, they're not going to pick it up. If you put your credentials into that Microsoft page, you can see it authenticating on M365 in the background, which is what we did. So we cycled through a couple of fake logins to get all of the different IP addresses of the attacker infrastructure, which is something I recommend you do. And do raise it with Microsoft because, as I said, they use that as part of a campaign to get all 240 domains. So do help them with that threat intelligence and dig when you find something like this. Next slide there, please, Alex. So with that test data, you can see some screenshots on the right-hand side there. Passwords that we typed in as part of our test data came through in October as part of the Onyx phishing logs that came into Searchlight Cyber. Really, it told us a lot. It told us whether sorry, excuse me. It told us whether the customer had in fact put in their credentials or not, because sometimes users do lie about the fact whether they suffered or succumbed to the phishing attack, whether they actually did put their credentials in. We were able to determine that they actually hadn't. They told the truth. But it came through with a whole lot of other customer data. It was a very comprehensive campaign. So there are some of our customers who are just dark web threat intelligence monitoring customers who don't have our SOC in place, and a whole lot of their credentials came through. And basically it means that one of their end users successfully put their password in and also answered their MFA, which meant whatever attacker had paid for that service, they were able to get a token. And as I said, that gives them access to the environment for a good 60 to 150 minutes in that victim's account. So what should you do about it if you've got data? Again, it could be historical data. The password might not be relevant anymore. And the data may have been lost, let's say, weeks or even months ago. But what happened in that 60 to 150 minute window? Typically, what the bad guy is going to do is he's going to put inbox rules that forward maybe some of the mails to himself, or delete specific mails that he sends through that mailbox. They could have gone onto SharePoint. They could have downloaded a whole bunch of stuff, looked at the calendar. Sorry, not the calendar, the address book, and downloaded a whole bunch of users from there. So go hunt, go find what happened in that mailbox for that period of time. Go and clear all those sessions for good measure. Even though it's unlikely that they've still got access, just go clear those sessions, which will force a relogin, and get them to change their password, not because the password has been lost, but largely because the pattern of the password has been lost. So we see it so often that people will change their password from autumn at 2024 to winter at 2024. And guess what's going to happen in 3 months' time? They're going to change it to the next season. And if the year changes, of course, along with that. The NCSC and NIST have really good guidance around how to set strong passwords that, you can change quite frequently if you have to, but they'll still stay quite memorable if you pick them in a particular way. So do get them to change their password. And of course, if their data has landed in the dark web, if it's come through in these phishing logs, even if it's old, it's an opportunity to educate that user how to spot a fake Microsoft login page, just based on the URL alone, because all the other stuff, exactly as Microsoft has presented it, is going to come through. So yeah, that's a bit of interesting background on a particular phishing kit. And perhaps, Rob, from a Searchlight perspective, you see so many of these and there's so much data. Perhaps you can give us an overview of what else is happening out there.
We do, Andy, and it's another one of those questions that we often get asked, like, how prolific is it? How concerned do I need to be around it? And we got our threat intelligence team to have a look into our data and try and understand if there has been an increase or a decrease in demand for these services. And ultimately, it was very challenging to identify this information, but we can start to see what seems to be a trend in activity. If we relate this similar to ransomware activities back in the day, something like Lockbit, when it first started, it was a ransomware group targeting industries by themselves. And then they started to develop their services, so coming that ransomware as a service, setting up their affiliate page and pushing it out to enable people to buy into it and use their capability to target potentially more organizations, make more money. And I think we're seeing a similar thing within the phishing as a service model. We're starting to see we're seeing people offering these services, and they vary from what it is they're offering. They change in how expensive they are, from sort of $100 for a page to be stood up through to several hundred and sometimes thousands of dollars for continued services. And generally what we're assessing from this activity is that you can buy very cheap services, phishing site as a service, to be stood up on your behalf. If you want to conduct a sort of persistent engagement utilizing a genuine looking phishing service, phishing site, you can outsource that to essentially designers, people who are capable in this activity, who will set that site up for you, maintain it for you, and enable you to start monetizing it down the line. And ultimately, they're getting something from this. As you can see on the image on the right-hand side, we've got a user from, I think this is from Breach Forums, Private Tools, and they are clearly offering a range of services here. So a Telegram panel offering two-factor authentication bypass page. And they're offering things like real-time interaction, device filtering to enable certain devices to be able to access this or potentially be rejected, enabling bot credentials to be seen or be hidden. There's all sorts of services that these users, these criminal actors are starting to offer, which can be found quite readily in the dark web, which again, it's about those lowering that bar to entry. People don't always need to be technically savvy these days to start becoming a potential threat to organizations. For a few $100, they can purchase these services and kind of let someone else do it on their behalf. And some of these other examples here that I've bullet pointed on the screen, LabHost was particularly prolific phishing as a service site, which was taken down earlier this year in April, indicating sort of how prolific it was. You know, these things generally are ongoing until they become too much of a nuisance or problematic to industry, that actually it becomes much more of an interest, much more of a focus, and organizations want to take these activities down. Because identifying affiliates and users of these services are generally difficult, we can start to identify that information as these sites get taken down and that information starts to become exposed. And as of April 24, when LabHost was shut down, it had in the region of 2,000 users operating it. Some of them are historical, some of them were active up to that point, but 2,000 people potentially, or buying this service to have someone else conduct these phishing, set up these phishing sites on their behalf, it's quite significant. And in this specific case, the prices range from $179 to $300. So again, quite a substantial way of monetizing these activities, which I imagine people are going to start looking at and will probably or likely start seeing more of this activity moving forward. We look at Evil Proxy as well. This is still available. This has been around since around about 2022. We've seen active engagement as of September this year. And this goes to show the sort of persistent side, where they, Evil Proxy, are currently offering services for $150 for maintaining a site for up to 10 days, or $400 for a month. So again, trying to provide that service and get user engagement in for a longer period of time, which ultimately increases the chances of success of such sites and creates more of a problem for our potential users and our clients. But as I say, phishing as a service platforms do require work. They need to be maintained and they need to be developed. So there aren't necessarily a huge amount around that we've seen. Maybe people don't necessarily all have the skills or don't want to sort of do it themselves. You know, you kind of get the target on your back. Like the ransomware operators, it can be more beneficial to be an affiliate or a user of such services. But we are seeing them pop up from time to time. And it's definitely something we are monitoring and seeing how this develops. Slide, please, Alex. So we sort of touched on, well, we've covered quite comprehensively the phishing actions and what we can do with phishing as a service. We've talked about leaked credentials, particularly around that phishing activity as well. And we can look at it from slightly different perspective, this initial access. So for those who aren't familiar with initial access brokers are essentially users who have achieved some sort of access in an organization, and then they essentially package up that access in whichever way it may be and sell it to an interested party. And this could come in the form of somebody buying some credentials on the dark web for a handful of dollars, trying to log into a remote portal or VPN with those credentials and gaining access successfully, and then not knowing what to do with them once they're in the network. So they list that on the dark web as verified credential access for a particular organization and monetize it. They sell that to particular individuals. Equally, it can be a little bit more sophisticated. Somebody may have used those credentials to gain access, or they may have compromised a vulnerability within an organization's infrastructure. Once they're in, they then enable persistence, installing a web shell, some remote access. Once they've got that access installed, they sell access to that proxy, that web shell, whatever it might be. And they're ultimately monetizing that access, that open door into this network. What we are seeing is that, like anything, it's a product that people need to sell. These initial access brokers have to try and sell that access to users, and they have to initiate interest in that product. What they try not to do is not name that organization specifically. So it's very hard. It's not impossible, but we rarely see people selling access to company X. Because inevitably organizations are looking for references to their company names, and it makes detection of that activity much easier. So these initial access brokers utilize this information around the organization, essentially profile it, and use data points to start referencing the organization that they've compromised. So without saying we've compromised company X, sorry if you just go back to Alex, without saying we've compromised company X, they will say we've compromised a particular industry, an energy organization within a particular geographic region, might be the United States. And then they specify that access type that they have. Is it VPN? Is it credential access, web shell? And then they start referencing things like revenue. If we go on the screen, please, Alex, we can start to see what these posts look like. So within Cerberus and within DarkIQ, we can start to look for this information. We can build queries around our organization. We can look for our company's name, but also look for our company profile. Where are we based? What industry do we sit in? What type of revenue do we have? All of this information is accessible in open source tooling like ZoomInfo, Crunchbase, RocketReach, and that is often utilized by these threat actors for that profiling piece. It's free and accessible, so why not? So we can quite readily start utilizing this information to cross-reference it with open source information to understand where which organization this potentially looks like. And this is an example from a few weeks ago where we identified this information, looked at it in Google. If we go on the slide, please, Alex. And really quickly, we can start to build out queries around this information. And in this particular case, we identified 4 organizations in the UK that matched this profile very specifically. We can go on a little bit further to start looking at this information in more detail. So often these posts will state how many hosts in this organization or how many devices they compromised, and you can start relating this to potentially the number of employees. I know sometimes it's not always exact match because people might have multiple devices, but we can get a rough idea. We can then, in this case, we took that information and start building profiles within DarkIQ to understand if there's any additional information and the leaked credentials, so the dark web traffic being identified in the dark web, that we can start to say, okay, this actually looks a little bit more interesting. What we saw here are these 4 profiles. One of them had very interesting information. So leaked credentials that we've already talked about to a degree today. We found specific information, multiple references to a particular user's email, multiple passwords being leaked in a recent breach. And again, we can verify that this user still operates at this organization and start to understand, okay, this could be an avenue of initial access. And just note the date on that slide of being 11th of August of 2024. When we move on to the next slide, we can also see activity related to things like traffic. So in this case, it's traffic from the dark web destined for this network's infrastructure, which we often see associated with reconnaissance activity. People's trying to use the dark web to anonymize and mask their activities. We don't know who it is, but we can see that something's happened. Again, this activity happened. We can see that for several months, there's no communications happening from the dark web at all. All of a sudden, we see 205 incoming communications on the same day that these credentials were leaked into the dark web. This isn't, again, it's not a smoke and gun. There's no silver bullet to these things, but it's these indicators of potential compromise or indicators of warning that we can go, okay, we can reset this user's particular account and make sure those credentials can't be utilized to gain access. Maybe we actually want to look at this user activity or these network logs at this point in time. Was those leaked credentials utilized to gain access to the network? If they were, what happened in that user account after this point in time? And we can start to assess and understand this activity in kind of early reconnaissance phase. This could just be a user trying to gain access and verify those credentials before they're sold on the dark web. And in that case, we potentially have days, potentially weeks to put mitigations in place and prevent this access from being exploited by a capable actor. Slide please, Alex.
Rob, just before we summarize there, I just had one quick question. So having followed that process, and you think that your organization is being targeted because you meet all the criteria, you've done a bit of digging, and it's likely that the initial access broker is selling data about yourself. Would you ever advocate to people to go and purchase that data themselves, to go and have a look to confirm whether it is in fact themselves?
That's a really good question. And in this scenario, we were able to identify a particular organization. So I believe an organization should be able to do the same. And it did give us the opportunity. We did engage with this actor, and we were able to verify the end organization who was the target victim. It's not something I would recommend an organization to do specifically because there are risks associated with it, understandably. Going onto the dark web can be dangerous, but having an organization who can potentially do that on your part can be really useful to almost provide that as a service. They understand how to do it, and they can do that on your behalf to verify this information. Potentially someone, I believe you've got that sort of experience in your back pocket.
Yeah, we do. Yes,
probably done.
But I think that's that's good advice, Rob, because it is you can probably cause more harm.
Yes,
if you try and do it yourself.
We don't want to raise the flags too early.
Correct. Yeah.
Brilliant. So that does bring us to the end. I'm conscious we're slightly overrunning, so we're going to move into Q&A in just a moment. But thank you, everybody, for sticking with us. And I just want to say thank you, Rob and Andy, for those examples you shared as well. I think they really brought to life those risks and how that access can be gained and kind of the entry points. So all the way from kind of that initial access through to it being sold, weaponized, what happens next. In terms of takeaways, let me know if you sort of see these differently as well. But the main things I thought just to call out here is beware blind spots. If you're not monitoring the dark web, that's a huge blind spot in your cyber defenses. Invest in software that allows you to do that, or work with a partner like Telenos Cybersecurity who can do that on your behalf. Criminals are brazen, as I said at the beginning, but they're also not stupid. That they're not going to put your company name into their posts and make it easy for you to find. However, they're going to use very similar tools to what perhaps your sales team, if you have one, or those tools that Rob shared earlier. Those are easy ways to use the same tools they're using to build those profiles. And as you saw, Rob was able to build 4 profiles. And very quickly, we identified which of those was the one which was being targeted. And lastly, leaked credentials, they should just be the start point of an investigation. So look into patterns, try and identify the behavior, whether that's accessing an internet like you shouldn't be, such as Andy mentioned with that kind of Netflix elephant path. I think we want to be wary of those and figure out why the behavior is happening, as well as just solving the issue. So with that, we have 3 questions in so far. I'll keep an eye if others come through, but I'm just going to direct these to both of you. Feel free to jump in if you think this one is for you. So the first one is on initial access brokers. The question is, why do they generally use the dark web if they know that companies like ours are monitoring them?
I imagine that's generally to do with the anonymity. I think, to be perfectly transparent, I think people operating the dark web know they're being monitored, tracked, and so on. It happens whenever something is going to be going around in sort of criminal activity. People want to look for it and protect against it. the reality is that the dark web offers quite a lot of anonymity around these user accounts. Although we can potentially see this information, we still don't necessarily know who it is. So they are protecting themselves to a degree from potentially being identified and arrested. So it probably gives them a little bit more anonymity to do this kind of activity with sort of little recourse. So they might lose some credentials. Again, loads of this activity, these things like credential logs are being sold for trivial amounts of money. He'll just go and buy the next load and cycle through them and see if they can be verified for access. Just list them again, rinse and repeat.
Thanks, Rob. And then the other one here as well. So this is a question more on I guess a senior leadership point of view. So how might you make a case for buying additional coverage, such as dark web, when budgets are tight in cybersecurity departments?
Alex, I think, it comes back to that earlier slide where I talked about measuring the efficacy of your existing controls. The best way to know whether your current investment is working is to see, are you leaking data? What does your attack surface look like? If you've implemented a bunch of controls and people are still losing credentials left, right, and center, then something's not working there. So, the whole thing about allocations of IT budget is measuring the value that you're going to get from every pound or dollar spent. Are you going to get that back? And if you're not measuring it in some way that you can quite easily show that data to others, it's quite difficult to motivate for the next dollar or pound. So I think, really it gives you a lot of visibility where you didn't have some before.
Yeah, agreed. If I might add to that as well, something we've talked about in previous conversations to quite a lot of degree is around understanding your organization's intelligence requirements and consequently the intelligence collection plans that fall out from that. If your requirements are to be able to identify and monitor this activity in the dark web or wherever it may be, and in your collection plan, the dark web is a gap in your visibility, it's another opportunity to bolster that business case to say, look, we're doing really well with our existing capabilities, but we've still got a gap in our visibility over here. We need something or services, whatever it may be, to fill that gap and provide that comprehensive visibility.
Brilliant, thank you. And the last one then as well, I think this is a really good one because it kind of summarizes the topic today, which is how do you spot criminals targeting you on the dark web? I think you both at various points said this. So the question reads, you said it's hard to track the risks from phishing as a service. What measures, therefore, do you recommend companies take, given it's so hard to track or to identify?
One of those links that I posted in the attachment, I think it was the middle one, that comes from Microsoft itself, or at least it's loosely based on advice from Microsoft. They give you a lot of remediations, things that you can set up on Microsoft 365 to make those attacker in the middle attacks more difficult. Things that you can detect for, so there's specific detection rules that come with that as well. So from a technical perspective, there's a lot of research in this space and a lot of good advice going around. But in terms of my research, I found that one to be the most comprehensive. It's got all the technical controls and remediations. Security awareness, ultimately it comes down to the human. If the human can spot it, the human can avoid it, and it's really tough. And quite often we think, let's fix it by pulling a lever on the Microsoft 365 admin console, but sometimes you also just need to focus on the end users, good training. Everybody needs to have a culture of security within the organization. It's everyone's problem or responsibility. And I think, that softer side also gets ignored, or it doesn't get as much airtime as the technical side.
Yeah, let he who's never taken an elephant path cast the first stone. So, cool. So thank you very much, Andy, for that. I think that brings us neatly to an end. Again, I appreciate people sticking with us a little bit longer there. If you do have follow-up questions, please share those with us. We will get notified of those coming through. We're happy to follow up and keep the conversation going with you over email. Otherwise, I hope you found this valuable. Please let us know in the feedback. I hope it sparks conversations where you work, and it's something we're happy to pick up with you both at Talanos Cybersecurity and Searchlight Cyber. On your way out of today's session, make sure to get your certificate, check out the attachments. There's lots of great stuff in there, all relating to what we presented today. Otherwise, the last thing for me to say is thank you to our presenters, Andy and Rob. Excellent job, guys. We are Searchlight Cyber. We are the dark web experts, and we look forward to seeing you on another webinar very soon. So have a fantastic rest of your day.